So I recently read a straight romance book, Happy Place by Emily Henry, which featured a lesbian couple as side characters. And in reading this book, I was struck by just how little I, a lesbian woman, related to the lesbian characters that I was reading about. You would think, as a queer person, I'd be overjoyed to see representation in a book that's not directly marketed towards the queer community. But instead, I finished Happy Place feeling a bit flat, a bit disappointed. The main characters in this book are a straight couple who have broken up, refused to tell their friends, whom they're now on this sort of like big annual holiday with. There are two straight couples in this, or one straight couple, one no longer couple, dealing with their own issues. And then there are Cleo and Kimmy, the third couple in the group who are lesbians, who it does transpire are now pregnant with their first child, which they also refuse to tell their friends about for no reason whatsoever. The whole book is full of what I would call straight people issues, like problems that I'm not dismissing as irrelevant to the people going through them, but just problems that are wholly unrelatable to me, a lesbian, who has dealt with a completely different hand of cards in her relationships. It was very clear to me that Emily Henry had very little ideas of the nuances of not only being a lesbian couple, but also being a lesbian couple surrounded by straight people, surrounded by straight culture, which I feel like a quick conversation with any lesbian ever could have probably solved for her. Now, I'm not claiming to know Emily Henry's writing process, the research she did before writing this couple, before writing this book, but all I can tell you is how I felt, and that was unrepresented. The book just didn't feel true to my experience as a lesbian woman. Which leads us on to the big question we're going to be exploring in this video: should straight authors be writing queer characters? Okay, maybe that's just a hook, maybe it is just a clickbaity title to get you to click on this video, because clearly there are a lot of layers to this, there's a lot to explore. Perhaps the better question should be, should straight authors be writing queer characters without doing their research, without talking to queer people? Like I said, I don't know what Emily Henry's process was in writing Happy Place and writing Cleo and Kimmy, but I thought it was very thought-provoking. So let's start with a brief overview of the history of queer literature. Context is very important. Queer literature obviously has a very rich history which has evolved alongside societal attitudes towards LGBTQ+ identities. In ancient texts, same-sex love and gender fluidity were often present but coded, as you might see in Sappho's poetry, which was 600 BCE, and Plato's Symposium. Then there was medieval and Renaissance literature like Shakespeare's sonnets, which did hint at homoerotic themes, and there was Japanese and Chinese traditions, including stories of male-male relationships. We move through to the 19th century, where writers like Oscar Wilde, who wrote The Picture of Dorian Gray, and Walt Whitman, who wrote The Leaves of Grass, expressed queer themes, though often very subtly, due to censorship. But then the early 20th century saw more openness with works like Radcliffe Hall's The Well of Loneliness from 1928, but then the Hays Code struck and queer themes were forced to be hidden away once more. I actually filmed a video on the Hays Code literally last week, so if you want to learn more about that, you can click the video up here somewhere. The Hays Code basically censored any queerness in Hollywood movies, which obviously did filter down to queer literature. But then following the Stonewall riots in 1969, queer literature once again began to flourish, with authors like Audre Lorde and Tony Kushner exploring identity, activism, and intersectionality. The late 20th and early 21st centuries brought even more visibility, with contemporary authors like Jeanette Winterson, Ocean Vuong, Alice Walker broadening representation. Today, queer literature spans all genres, but especially YA, sci-fi, and fantasy, which focus on diverse identities, even trans narratives and non-binary experiences. So once hidden in subtext, queer voices are now much more central to storytelling, which raises very important questions about representation, which brings us back round to the subject of this essay today: should straight authors be writing queer characters? It could be argued, of course, that authentic representation requires lived experiences, but others believe that fiction should be expansive, allowing all writers to explore all diverse identities, as long as they're doing it with care and research. But should the priority maybe be in elevating queer voices in publishing, rather than letting straight people tell our queer stories? So, the case for representation. If you're here on this video, on this channel, I probably don't need to tell you how important queer representation is in literature. Hi, I'm Georgia, I talk about queer books on the internet, it's kind of my entire thing. But this representation isn't just for LGBTQ plus readers who want to see themselves reflected in their stories, but for everyone. Books shape how we see the world, and when queer characters are present, complex, and well written, it helps normalise diverse identities and experiences. I truly believe, like to my core, that people are scared of things they don't understand, that a lack of education is at the basis of a lot of homophobia, misogyny, racism, etc., all that kind of horrible stuff that we see in the world. And education doesn't just come in the form of sitting in a classroom. Education comes from everything, but particularly through the media and literature that we consume every single day. When queer characters exist naturally in stories that aren't solely about their identity, it can help normalise their presence in everyday life. Not every queer character needs to have a coming out arc or a struggle with their identity. Sometimes they can just be there as friends, siblings, co-workers, or background characters, just like we are in real life. Too often, stories assume a default of straight and cisgender unless explicitly stated otherwise, which does reinforce the idea that queerness is something other than just a way of existing. So, including queer characters, even in books with primarily straight narratives, does help break that pattern. It sends the message to the reader that LGBTQ plus people are a natural and undeniable part of the world, that our existence doesn't always need to be the focal point of a story to matter. And the opposite is true for not including queer characters in books as well. That sends a message that they're to be hidden away, that they don't exist naturally in society. For queer readers, it's life-changing to find a book that makes them finally feel seen, especially in a world that hasn't always embraced them. I remember reading my first ever queer book and just being amazed that the feelings I was having were written by somebody else. I thought I was an alien. I thought I was so weird, so strange for having these thoughts, but to finally see it reflected back at me, honestly, I can't tell you how much that changed my life. And even in an otherwise straight book, having a queer character does make you feel like you've been thought about, like your existence is being acknowledged. For straight readers, having queer characters in books fosters empathy and understanding. So the more inclusive stories that we have, the less isolated people feel, and the more society as a whole hopefully grows. So could it be argued that any representation, even if it's poor representation, is better than no representation at all? Like, surely it's only a good thing if more and more authors are including LGBTQ plus characters in their books, even as smaller side characters. If only a handful of books include queer characters, then those few examples bear the weight of representing an entire community, which can lead to overgeneralization or narrow portrayals. So more representation means more diverse, layered, and realistic depictions. Out of every 10 books, at least one of those must represent a multi-dimensional, well-written queer character. Surely. And that means something. Like, that's important for straight people, for people who might not otherwise have any exposure to the queer community. That's important for them to read about. Even if it is perhaps not the best representation in the world, if maybe a queer person themselves would read that and be like, oh, that's bad representation, I don't like that. But a straight person who doesn't have any exposure to that world otherwise, might not think that way. But obviously, all of this comes with the risk of stereotypes and misrepresentation. This is the argument on the other side of the coin. When straight people are taking it upon themselves to be a voice for the queer community, to feature queer characters, there's always the risk of stereotypes and misrepresentation. No matter how well-intentioned the writer might be, you're never going to be able to tell that story as well as somebody from that community. I think the perfect example of this comes in the form of a lot of comments that I found on Reddit and on other forums online whilst I was researching for this video. There are a lot of people, it turns out, in writing forums asking how to write queer characters, writers clearly eager not to get the representation wrong, which is a very good thing. Doing the research is never going to be something that I turn my nose up at, although I would maybe argue that talking to queer people in person is always going to be much more helpful with the nuances, but not everyone has access to queer people, I suppose. However, what I found was a barrage of people giving absolutely terrible advice. Straight people who clearly don't have a clue about what it is to live as a queer person in this very straight, very heteronormative society, telling other straight people how to write queer characters. What it seems they fail to realise is that the queer experience is inherently different from the straight experience. Queer people experience the world, experience society very differently. In response to one of these "how do I write a gay person" questions on Reddit, Purple Galaxy said 7 years ago, "Gay people aren't a different species. The only difference between a straight man and a gay man is that gay men like to be fucked by men." Which, from a very straight perspective, sure, maybe I can understand what the user was trying to say here, like inherently a person is a person at the end of the day. But what this comment does is erases the entire lived experience of the gay man. I'm sure any gay man would love to say that his life experience has been exactly the same as that of his parallel straight man, but he just sleeps with men instead. However, we all know that is not the case. The vast majority of gay men will have faced homophobia throughout their lives, the fear of being hate crimed if they out themselves. Am I walking right? Do I look too gay? Is this shirt going to draw too much attention? Can I hold my partner's hand in this part of town and not be subjected to stares, comments, or physical altercations? If I admit my sexuality out loud, am I going to lose everyone that I love? Reducing sexuality down to purely who it is you like to have sex with is incredibly reductive. Obviously, I can't speak from a gay man's perspective, but I can tell you that reducing my sexuality down to liking to sleep with women dismisses so much of my lived experience. The way that I relate to women is entirely different to that of my straight friends. I feel so much power, so much beauty in not just my romantic relationships, but platonic ones too. The tenderness I feel in my relationship with my wife, the way that we can relate to each other, the understanding of each other's life experiences is something that when I speak to my straight friends, they can't relate. I'm not saying by any means that the lesbian experience is better than the straight experience, although maybe sometimes I might think that. Maybe I'm biased, but it is undeniably just incredibly different. Straight people are never going to understand the intricacies, the beauty of being a woman who is loved by another woman. And the piece of advice directly under Purple Galaxies in that Reddit thread is just as terrible. Hypercubed4 said, "Write male and females that are heterosexual, write a relationship between them. At the end of it, make both of them male or both of them female." Excuse me? Seriously? I mean, I suppose this person is kind of saved by saying underneath, sure, there won't be any homosexual nuance to it, but it's better than trying really hard to create something complex and failing miserably. But I think therein lies the problem. Straight people, I'm assuming that user is straight because this is terrible advice I hope no queer person would ever say, would rather write a subpar queer character than put in the time and research to actually getting it right. Fenutus wrote 5 years ago, "Is it a guy? Replace any instances of girlfriend with boyfriend. A girl? The other way around. Unless you want to do a story about discrimination or culture or societal norms." Once again, reducing the entire queer experience to our trauma. You, straight author, can be expected to put in the research about how to write a queer character if you're going to be writing about their suffering. If they're happy, don't worry about it, that's boring, just replace girlfriend with boyfriend. But queer joy is such a wonderful, powerful thing. I think back to the very famous quote from the days of the AIDS crisis. "During the darkest days of the AIDS crisis, we buried our friends in the morning, we protested in the afternoon, and we danced all night. And it was the dance that kept us in the fight because it was the dance that we were fighting for." Even within some of our darkest times of queer history, joy is a thing that got us through. Joy is strategic. Joy helps keep the fight going. And I think in writing about queer suffering, that is very easily forgotten. Even straight authors with the best intentions can fall victim to some of the very harmful tropes that have plagued queer literature for decades. I'm talking bury your gays, tragic queer love stories, fetishization, that's really hard to say by the way, and invisible representation. And if we're talking invisible representation, then there's no better example to talk about than Albus Dumbledore from the Harry Potter series by she who may not be named, that awful, awful woman. Throughout the core 7 Harry Potter books, there was never any indication that Dumbledore may have been gay. He was an old wizard, an old professor who didn't ever seem to be in any relationship with anyone. But none of the professors in Harry Potter ever seemed to be in relationships. There was never a single indication of queerness from Dumbledore. He wasn't even, in my opinion, really gay coded as a character. There was nothing about him apart from maybe dressing a bit flamboyantly that made me think in any way that he could be gay. It was never written in the pages that Dumbledore was a gay man. The author instead revealed his sexuality after the release of the books, stating that she always believed him to be gay and in a relationship with his childhood bestie, Gellert Grindelwald. And almost immediately upon her saying this, the queer community was split with opinions. Is it positive that one of the most well-known characters in one of the most well-known movie or book series in the planet is now going to be thought of as gay? Like, that does amazing things for representation. Or is it almost offensive that the author realised in 2007 that queerness was becoming cool, that it was being spoken about more openly, and she wanted to tag on to this trend? She very conveniently announced this for the very first time after the 7th book had already been released. It wasn't going to affect her sales. The series was finished. At the end of the day, Dumbledore being gay means nothing when it's not shown, when it's not spoken about. It adds to the idea that queerness should be hidden. And I feel it shows weakness for an author to explain canon outside of the story. Like, either say it in the story or don't. Don't continue making up stories just for the sake of it. Like, why? If you don't say it in the story because you're scared it's going to affect your sales, then you don't get to count as an ally. My research does tell me that in Fantastic Beasts 3, Dumbledore's sexuality is more directly addressed, with Dumbledore directly saying that he was in love with Grindelwald. But by that point, who really cared about this franchise anymore? Let's be honest. Like, who watched the 3rd Fantastic Beasts movie? And as far as I was able to find, the word gay was still not mentioned in the movie. I might be wrong on that. I didn't watch it, but I did do a lot of research into this, and apparently gay is not said. The idea of love is more palatable to straight conservative audiences. Like, it's very hard to be mad at love, but it's very easy to be mad at gay. It's lazy. It's very lazy representation. Besides, any queer representation in the Harry Potter universe is immediately diminished by the overt harm the author has done to the LGBTQ+ community in recent years with her rampant, horrific, awful transphobia. And that just adds a whole other layer of frustration to the Dumbledore being gay argument. When you're not a part of the community that you're talking or writing about, it becomes very easy to fall victim to the harmful tropes that are so prevalent in queer media. You might not mean to, you might have all of the best intentions in the world, but as a straight person, you are likely not involved in queer culture. You're likely not very aware of these things, aware of these tropes. And I do think another very important thing to bear in mind when writing queer stories is the difference between writing about queerness as an identity versus writing about queerness as a theme. Queerness as an identity means that you center queerness as a core aspect of that character's journey. The story might explore their lived experiences, their struggles, and importantly, the joys of being queer. It's very central to the story. So in queerness as an identity, we're maybe talking about coming out journeys, self-discovery, family and societal reactions. We're talking about navigating relationships, not only romantic, but familial and platonic too. We're looking at intersections of queerness, how race, gender, disability and culture can all further shape a queer identity. We're thinking about facing discrimination, the homophobia, the transphobia, and the social alienation that can come alongside being queer. In my personal experience, I often find that straight people are aware of homophobia, of course, as a concept, but when I talk to my straight friends about the alienation that can come along with being queer, about never quite fitting in a straight environment, always feeling like you can't quite connect, they tend to look at me like side-eye emoji. Like, they just don't quite get it. Some examples of books that focus on queerness as an identity might maybe be Red, White and Royal Blue by Casey McQuiston, or The Miseducation of Cameron Post by Emily M. Danforth, or Felix Ever After by Karen Callender. Obviously, writing about some of these topics does require a deep knowledge of the emotional and societal realities of being a queer person, and you risk falling into stereotypes like the tragic queer narrative or hypersexualization. For example, The Miseducation of Cameron Post is a tragic queer narrative. It's about a girl who is living with her hyperconservative aunt who finds out that she's gay and ships her off to conversion camp to conversion therapy. This is a very sensitive subject to write about. It's a story that requires a lot of nuance, a very deep understanding of the queer experience. Emily M. Danforth is gay herself. She's married to a woman. She would have a much deeper understanding of the emotions surrounding all of this than a straight author might do. That's not to say that a straight author couldn't do a very intense amount of research and write a similar story, like I'm sure that's very possible, but when you're writing about deep queer trauma, you'll probably never fully understand unless you have that deep queer trauma yourself. Queerness as a theme, however, is where queerness exists within a story, but it's not the main focus. It's just a natural part of the world, natural part of a character's identity, without being the central conflict or central storyline. This is most often seen in genres maybe like fantasy or sci-fi, where queerness is much more normalised, it's just a regular part of this fantasy world. But you do obviously see it in other genres as well. Characters just happen to be queer, but their queerness isn't the driving force behind the plot. Examples of queerness as a theme might be The Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller, Gideon the Ninth by Tamsin Muir, or maybe The Priory of the Orange Tree by Samantha Shannon. I haven't actually read the latter two books, but when I was researching this topic, they kept coming up again and again and again. They were being screamed at me. I'm sharing that with you. So this is a case of characters simply just being queer. Like, queerness is not a big part of the plot. They are just queer. And this is where I think the aforementioned Happy Place by Emily Henry falls. The lesbian characters in that are just queer who happen to be a part of the story. But often when written by straight authors with all of the best intentions of the world, this causes a lack of depth. The queer characters feel underdeveloped or queer in name only, not queer in their actions. Despite what is apparently popular belief, queerness does affect your entire life, not just who you sleep with. In books like this, queerness can also feel like a background decoration, something to maybe add a bit of spice to an otherwise very straight book. Like, if a story boasts about having queer representation but never explores the characters' relationships, identity, or experiences in any meaningful way, it can feel very shallow, like a box-ticking exercise. And we're not talking about having to make the entire story here about queerness. Like, not every story with a queer character has to be about that. But often the relationships, the life experiences of queerness aren't taken into account when writing that character. Which I suppose brings us on to part 4 of this video. I don't know if there are going to be parts in my editing, but in writing this is part 4, and that is, who gets to tell the story? Like, what are the ethics of writing outside your lived experience? And I'm not just talking about queerness here, like, the idea of this extends way beyond the bounds of just that. There have been a lot of controversies over white authors writing stories about BIPOC characters, flattening cultural experiences. Non-disabled authors often write disabled characters through the lens of tragedy or inspiration porn. I remember there being a lot of criticism of Me Before You by Jojo Moyes, for example, the portrayal of an assisted suicide as a solution to disability. And I'm sure we've all fallen victim to men writing female protagonists really, really terribly, over-sexualising them or clearly having no idea what the female experience is on Earth. Lived experience brings authenticity, and bad representation has real-life consequences. Not even necessarily real-life consequences for the author, but bad rep shapes public perception. It can reinforce harmful ideas. Focusing back on the queerness, which is what this video is about, if a straight person entirely outside of the queer bubble is reading a book where the side character is a trope of a gay person, like full of stereotypes, then that straight person is going to walk away thinking that that is normal, that all queer people fall into that stereotype. And stereotypes are very strong. It doesn't take much to reinforce them, like they're stereotypes for a reason. How many more times can I say stereotype? People don't question them. This can be something small and seemingly nothing to worry about, like the stereotypical GBF, gay best friend, who is there only to serve the straight female lead with yas queens and finger snaps and flamboyant outfits. Or it can be much more insidious. It can be the predatory, creepy lesbian, the gay villain. At the end of the day, good representation requires deep engagement with the community being written about. Authors need to ask themselves if they're the best person to be telling this story, or are they willing to do the research, the necessary work to get it right. And this is where the importance of research, of sensitivity readers and community engagement comes in. If authors want to write queer characters well, they need to go beyond surface level understandings. They need to go beyond assumptions. So here is my list of essential steps for ethical representation. Number 1, research properly. Read books by queer authors, listen to first-hand experiences, understand queer history. Obviously, the true length you have to go to does depend on how prominent the queer character is, but any research is going to give you a better understanding on how to write a queer person. Number 2, engage with the community. Talk to queer people again and be open to critique. Number 3, use sensitivity readers, like get people from the queer community to read your work and point out inaccuracies or harmful tropes. And 4, be prepared to take responsibility. If feedback is negative, listen and learn. All in all, I don't think it's about whether straight authors can write queer characters, can write queer stories, because of course they can. It's about whether they're willing to put in the effort to do it responsibly. I think a lot of what people can fall victim to is the concept of straight allyship. Straight people who think they're great allies simply because they don't actively go out seeking to harm LGBTQ+ people in everyday life. The people who might rub shoulders with queer people and never think anything of it. Maybe they even have queer friends, but they perpetuate the harmful stereotypes and or diminish the queer experience. It's straight people that think they're being supportive by being like, gay people, they're just like us, there's no difference, they just sleep with a different sex. But there is a difference. Diminishing the queer experience to just sex is so insulting. I can't escape my queerness when I leave the bedroom. It's straight people who say, I don't care if you're gay, love is love. It sounds very supportive, but ignores the fact that acceptance isn't the same as active allyship. It's straight people who are like, I have a gay friend, so I get it. No, you don't. You don't, because you're still straight. You walk through the world straight. There are so many straight people out there who are actively trying to be supportive, and I'm not shitting on trying to be supportive. But these people fail to take into account the nuance of the queer experience because they're simply ignorant to it. By just existing, queer people have many struggles that their straight counterparts may fail to notice. Being an ally is about supporting the community actively and not expecting to be praised for it. You should listen and uplift queer voices instead of making yourself the main character in the narrative. You don't deserve a trophy for just not being an active homophobe, for not being an arsehole. And homophobia is so much deeper than just active hatred or physical violence. When you're queer, it's something you feel in every aspect of your life. It's the little things, like the way people look at you when you walk through the streets holding hands with your partner. It's the double takes, the side eyes, the lingering stares. Straight couples hold hands all the time without a second thought, but for queer people, you've got to scan for reactions. You wonder if the people staring at you are safe. Are they just curious, or are they disgusted? Are they going to say something, or are they going to hurt us? Like, the constant awareness is exhausting. And then there's the double standards around PDA, the way people police queer affection in ways they would never do with a straight couple. A straight couple can kiss in a restaurant or cuddle in the park and no one bats an eye. No one notices because it's normal, it's accepted. But when a queer couple does the same thing, people notice and people comment. We're not being any more PDA than the straight couples sat over there doing exactly the same thing, but society has conditioned people to see even the tiniest displays of queerness as inappropriate or even inherently political. People think that they have the right to comment and we must be asking for it, right? Because we're doing it in public. Homophobia isn't always loud and aggressive. It's not always overt hatred, violence, or exclusion. Sometimes it manifests in much more subtle ways, in the ways that people dismiss or downplay queer experiences, when people refuse to acknowledge the differences in experience, when people say, it's not that bad anymore, you guys have rights, or why do you even need pride? Straight people don't get a parade, or I don't even see you as gay, you're just a person, which does sound like a compliment but actually just erases a huge part of somebody's identity. More than once, I've had straight people say to me that I'm being dramatic when I talk about the queer experience being vastly different from the straight experience. I have no doubt I'll get some of the same comments on this video. I'm waiting for them. I know they'll come. It's stop playing the victim, you're overreacting. It's why does everything have to be about being gay all the time with you? But the truth is that queer people have to think about their identity all the time because the world constantly reminds us that we're different. Straight people never have to explain or justify their relationships. If we talk about these experiences, we're seen as dramatic, but if we stay silent, nothing changes. One of my least favourite subtle homophobias is when people are like, you're just rubbing it in people's faces, like why do you need to talk about it all the time when I'm actually barely talking about being queer? But straight people remind us of their sexuality every single day as well when they talk about their husbands or their wives, when they have a photo of their other half up on their desk at work. Like, that's normal. That's people rubbing sexuality in faces. That's people making their sexuality known. But no, you only notice when queer people do it. I could go on, and I will go on. There's the way queer couples aren't treated as real couples, constantly having to prove their legitimacy. It's the way lesbian couples are overtly sexualised, the way that gay men are at higher risk of being hate crimed, and the ever-present fear of what if, having to weigh up every move you make in case you out yourself to the wrong person or hold hands in the wrong place. Straight privilege isn't just about what straight people get, it's about what they never have to think about. You as a straight person might not see homophobia every day, but queer people feel it every day. True acceptance, true allyship isn't about just saying, I'm okay with people being gay. It's about challenging the system alongside queer people. It's about actively fighting. Another one of my big pet peeves in life is the straight girlies who are like, I love gay people, but they're just talking about gay men. And also their boyfriends are incredibly homophobic and they call themselves allies. And that could be a whole video in itself again. It drives me insane. And all of this subtle homophobia can be through media representation. Yep, we're bringing it back round full circle to the books. A one-dimensional portrayal of LGBTQ+ characters in books or movies can reinforce harmful stereotypes, it can erase complexity, and contribute to a culture where queer identities aren't taken seriously or given the same depth as straight characters. It's fair to say that this might come from ignorance rather than from malice, but intent doesn't erase impact. When LGBTQ+ people are constantly written as flat token characters or only defined by their sexuality, it does uphold this broader pattern of marginalisation. It can reinforce implicit biases and limit how queer people are perceived and understood in society. So whilst a single example of shallow representation might not be actively homophobic, it still exists within a system that has historically sidelined or misrepresented LGBTQ+ people. Calling it out isn't about labelling the author as bigoted, but rather just recognising how media can perpetuate inequality, like even unintentionally. Part 5, part 6, I've lost count of parts now. Am I even doing parts? Who knows? Queer authors. I do think one thing I haven't touched on yet in this video, in this essay, is that whilst I clearly do think that straight authors can write queer characters, it's also important to prioritise queer authors when looking to read specifically queer books. They don't just research the queer experiences, like queer authors, they lived them. For many, many decades, queer stories were always told through a straight lens, through a homophobic, Hays Code-induced straight lens. Again, yes, I do have a video on the Hays Code if you want to go watch that. So shifting the focus now in the 21st century to queer voices is so important. It allows for more diverse and more accurate narratives. Many of the most damaging portrayals of queer people, the tragic gaze trope, bury your gays, the gay villain, the predatory gaze, have been popularised and perpetuated by straight authors. And whilst I'm not going to say that queer authors would never do those things, they're more likely to write from a place of care about their own community. But despite this, queer authors can still struggle to get published. It's getting better, don't get me wrong, but there is very much an uphill battle going on here. Many high-profile queer books, like The Song of Achilles, like The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo, are written by straight authors, asterisks. I did research to see if these authors are straight. Everything suggests they were. I can't find any reference to them being queer. Straight is the default. I don't, they may be queer, I don't think they are, they may be, Okay, yeah. But my point is, publishers will often prioritise the queer stories that do feel safe or palatable to a mainstream, straight audience. A straight author writing a queer story is seen as brave, as groundbreaking. A queer author telling their own story is too niche. For example, Alice Oseman has spoken publicly about how publishers told her time and time and time again that their queer stories, Heartstopper being one of them, simply wouldn't sell. Now everyone knows Heartstoppers. If you haven't read the comics, you've probably seen the show on Netflix. It's a huge success. So there has always been an audience for queer stories, but publishers have rarely been willing to take the risk. They'd rather put the risk on a straight author writing queer stories than a queer author writing queer stories. Does the success of Heartstopper mean that they're more willing to take the risk going forward? Probably not, because the world is currently a very scary place, with more and more right-wing people coming into power. Fascism is sadly on the rise, and what does fascism lead to? Book bans, censorship. So many queer books, especially those featuring trans characters or stories of queer joy, are being banned in the USA, and this includes hugely successful LGBTQ+ books like Red, White and Royal Blue, The Perks of Being a Wallflower, Genderqueer, All Boys Aren't Blue, etc, etc. If books that were this widely successful are now being banned, what's going to push publishers to put their money behind more queer books? Queer authors need more support. Is it easier for a publisher to put their money behind a straight person's watered-down version of queerness, to still be able to tick that box of inclusivity whilst not putting themselves on the line too much? And this is where we begin to run into the issue of straight author voices being heard over those of queer people. And here is where we're going to begin to wrap up this video with the question of, should identity be a prerequisite for writing certain stories? There are some solid arguments for queer authors writing queer stories. It's the lived experience that brings depth that research, no matter how deeply it's done, simply cannot replicate. Many damaging portrayals of queer people have come from straight authors getting it wrong. And there's the equity that I just mentioned as well. Queer authors already struggle to get published. Prioritising them helps balance the playing field. But there are also some solid arguments against restricting who can write what. At the end of the day, fiction is about imagination, and good writers should be able to step into experiences outside of their own. Otherwise, storytelling as a whole just becomes very narrow. Some could argue that over-policing who can write what could lead to gatekeeping or censorship, and identity alone doesn't guarantee a good or responsible story. A queer author can write a problematic portrayal of a queer person, and the question can even go even deeper than that. Like, should a lesbian be okay to write a gay man? Should a lesbian be okay to write a trans person? Like, just because they all come under the same LGBTQ+ umbrella, that doesn't mean you know everyone's experiences. Obviously, there is a middle ground here. Instead of banning straight authors from writing queer stories, the goal should just be to encourage them to do the work. If a straight person is writing a book with queerness as the identity, you should be doing the work. Research, listen to queer voices, use sensitivity readers. And then there's the whole question of profiting off the stories of a marginalised group as well that you're not a part of. Like, should you be looking at working maybe with charities, with making donations? Maybe that shouldn't be a prerequisite, but it would be maybe a nice touch, I think. But if it's just a book with queerness as a theme, side characters who are simply just gay, doing the research and talking to queer people, getting those sensitivity readers, it should be enough. Also, as a straight author writing queer stories, it's probably important that you fight for queer authors to get equal opportunities. We cannot get to a point again, as it has been in history, where straight voices dominate this space, where straight people only tell the stories of queer people. At the end of the day, a big part of this comes down to just writing with care and respect, but care and respect alone aren't enough. You need to make sure that you're also doing the story, doing the queer character justice, that they are more than a stereotype or a trope, that they are a fully fledged character in their own right. When I was writing this video, I did start to go down a rabbit hole about authors who are just like bad, where all side characters are one-dimensional simply because care isn't taken in the writing. And I suppose in cases like that, you can't take a badly written queer side character personally, but that just opens us up to a wider conversation about how some books are just bad books, and I'm not going to fall into that. I tried, it was a whole thing. That discussion could go on forever, and it begins to get a bit like whataboutism-y. So in conclusion, yes, of course straight authors can write queer characters, but care needs to be taken. And I'm going to bring it back around here full circle. Characters like Cleo and Kimmy in Happy Place weren't supposed to be offensive. They weren't supposed to be frustrating. I have no doubt in my mind that Emily Henry had all the best intentions in the world when she was writing them, wanting to simply include representation in her book. But it is undeniably frustrating when it's clear that somebody is writing about something that they simply don't understand. One of the main storylines in Happy Place is that Cleo and Kimmy are getting increasingly frustrated with their friends. Sabrina and Parth for how pushy they're being, Harriet and Wynne for keeping secrets. Whilst the couple themselves have also been keeping a secret, they've been going through what I'm sure would have been a pretty lengthy process to get pregnant. For a lesbian couple, that process is a lot more involved than it would be for a lot of straight couples, obviously with the sidebar that there are people who struggle with infertility. If I were Cleo and Kimmy in this story, I would have been endlessly frustrated at this friendship group for reasons entirely different than they were in the book. The pregnancy plotline just feels like a perfect example of how queerness was overlooked in this book. For a lesbian couple, fertility treatment, sperm donors, the legal, financial, emotional hurdles of getting pregnant are a major part of the experience. Yet the book treats their pregnancy as if they're just any other couple expecting a baby. Emily Henry didn't need to center their struggles, but she should have at least acknowledged them. The queerness in Happy Place just feels very surface level rather than deeply integrated into the characters' lived experiences. Representation isn't just about saying that a character is queer, it's about acknowledging how queerness shapes their world, their relationships, their struggles. Cleo and Kimmy aren't just lesbians in a vacuum, they exist in a world that treats them differently because they are lesbians, but the book doesn't reflect that reality. The pair are clearly in a lesbian relationship in the book, like that point isn't skirted around, but it's never mentioned other than the fact that they are in a relationship. And it's lovely that clearly the friendship group does accept and love them. Am I saying I want it to be pointed out and have them othered in every chapter? Like, absolutely not. But the refusal to touch on certain issues that without a doubt would arise in real life, the subtle homophobias and microaggressions I've spoken about throughout this video, made me just very aware of the fact that Emily Henry isn't aware of that being the standard, of that being the reality of the queer experience. Cleo in this book is an activist, she's a fighter, she's a very outspoken person, but there's not a single ounce of queer activism from her in this book. Like, why does that never come into play? Even if the book isn't about activism, it's very odd that her queerness is something that she never really talks about, especially given her entire personality. So yeah, it's sometimes not enough just to say a character is queer, the writing has to reflect that. Good intentions don't always equal good representation. So, in conclusion, yes, of course straight authors can write queer characters, but the real question is, should they if they're not willing to do the work? Representation isn't just about including queer characters, it's about understanding them. This is why sensitivity readers and actual queer voices in publishing are so important, especially in the current political climate. Straight authors can write queer characters, but if they aren't doing the research, if they're not seeking feedback and ensuring their portrayals ring true, the result is often characters who technically exist as representation, but don't actually represent queer life. And when queer authors still struggle to get published, while straight authors tell very watered down versions of our stories, it becomes even more frustrating. At the end of the day, representation should feel real, not just inserted for diversity points, because when queerness is written without depth, it doesn't feel like representation at all, it just feels like a missed opportunity, and that is incredibly frustrating, especially as a queer reader. Clearly, I really enjoyed writing that video. That was over 7,000 words long, by the way. That took me a long time to write, and I can't wait to hear all of your opinions in the comments down below. Hopefully, I presented a very even-sided, fair argument there. Thank you so much for tuning in today. If you've watched all the way to the end, then well done. Thank you. Make sure you are subscribed to this channel, because clearly you like what I'm doing, and I want to make more videos like this. So if you've got any other ideas for similar subjects, similar topics, then let me know in the comments as well. I'm going to go read a book now. That is my big plan for the afternoon. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Bye, guys.